What up guys, welcome to my Dragonflight PvP solo queue DPS tier list video. In this video I will share my point of view and experience based on the beta's current balance state. I am by no means an entitled multi-gladiator player. I have however been PvPing since the original Wrath of the Lich King launched, and I keep myself up to date with every spec. As such, I would like to share with you what I believe is an informed opinion of the current state of the game. Without further ado, let's get to it. Hope you enjoy. Instead of a D tier, I have decided to add an A+ tier because the game is currently more balanced than what we were used to in Shadowlands. And as such, the gap between S and B tier is not as big as it used to, so I believe an A+ tier fits better. Let's start with the warrior. Warriors used to have to decide between Stormbolt or Double Time, effectively deciding between crowd control or mobility. That is no longer the case. Warriors can now have both. Warriors have very high mobility, decent crowd control, amazing peel capability through Intervene, very good utility through Shattering Throw, which removes Divine Shields, Ice Blocks, and other effective shields. Both warrior specs have a healing reduction effect, harms warrior through Mortal Strike, and Fury warrior through Rampage while using a PvP talent. Warriors have percentage HP based self-heal through Impending Victory, and a percentage based team HP buff through Rallying Cry. Fury warriors do a lot of damage, they have incredible self-healing, they heal themselves so much that sometimes they out-heal the healers. Fury warrior now has access to defensive stance, reducing their damage taken by 20%, which when combined with a 10% damage reduction from the Enrage talent, gives you a flat 30% damage reduction with almost 100% uptime. So we have a mobile class with a lot of damage, good burst, 30% damage reduction permanently, and self-heals that rival the healers themselves. Fury warrior is without a doubt an A+ tier class. Arms warrior hasn't been tuned yet, it currently does no damage, and we will have to wait for Blizzard to finally tune it in order to make an informed decision. Next up, Retribution Paladin. Paladins currently do a lot of damage, and crazy enough, most of their damage is done from range. This helps making up for their lack of mobility, because even though you can't get to your target, you can still effectively damage them from 40 yards away. Paladins are known for their very good self-healing and team utility, and that is still in place. Our crowd control capability has been buffed, as we now can have Repentance in addition to the Hammer of Justice cooldown reduction talent. Retribution Paladins are able to break themselves out of breakable crowd control with Hand of Sacrifice. This is incredibly useful, and I don't see Retribution Paladins taking advantage of this enough, myself included. Paladins have very good cleave damage, a very high burst potential, however, our damage is coming from the wrong sources. Most of our damage comes from the Lawbringer PvP talent plus Judgment. That makes our current viable playstyle boring, as the biggest portion of our damage should come from holy power spenders and not from generators. This makes the rotation feel unrewarding, as you are not working towards a big Templar's Verdict, but working towards a filler. Not to say that Templar's Verdict / Final Verdict / Justicar's Vengeance doesn't do good damage, of course it does. What I'm saying is that we don't have enough mobility or holy power generation to Templar's Verdict when we need to. Paladins are the less mobile melee class in the game, and we rely on team crowd control or at least slows in order to be able to stick to a mobile target. We are known for our Divine Shield and Blessing of Protection, however both of these spells can easily be shattered, dispelled or even stolen. Paladins have punishing long global cooldowns, often making you have to choose between using a defensive or attempting to finish off the enemy. It does feel very clunky to have to use a defensive on a teammate and not having the global cooldown to do so. With all of this said, Retribution Paladin is still very powerful due to their high damage, however they are easy targets and rely heavily on team coordination. This means that in organized team play, a Retribution Paladin can rank as high as S tier, but in solo queue, I'm struggling to give it A tier. Now to the Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter is currently a very complete class that has access to everything. You have very high damage, very high mobility, very high burst, incredibly good instant cast crowd control. Imprison is effectively an instant cast cyclone with 45 seconds cooldown. and like Cyclone it is unbreakable through damage, which makes it the perfect solo queue cross CC ability, as your team or yourself cannot break it by mistake. Demon Hunters have a strong high uptime healing reduction effect, amazing self-healing, percentage-based self-healing through killing the spawn demon from the talents, a 10-second cooldown dispel that you can use for example to take out bops, and our current build is a dot-based damage build, which means that even if you get crowd controlled, most of your damage is still going out. It also allows you to keep people in combat longer, and makes it hard for stealth classes to go invisible. The only problem Demon Hunters have is that they are very sensitive to nerfs, as nerfing their damage also directly nerfs their defense, since they rely on lifesteal damage to stay alive. Demon Hunter is no doubt an S tier class. Now to the new class, the Drag tier Evoker. Evokers have very high damage on the move, and one of the highest burst damage skills in the game. They are highly mobile, they have one of the longest CC chains in the game and can use all of it while on the move. None of their damage needs to be cast. Your main ability is a channeled skill, which means that you can move behind line of sight after using it and it won't break. Evoker has amazing team utility. They have a skill where you can grab a teammate and reposition him while giving both of you a 30% HP shield on a 1 minute cooldown. This skill alone can and often will save you the game. Evokers have very good defensives, and one of them, when paired with a PvP talent, makes you immune to interrupts, allowing you to either channel your highest damage ability or use your entire CC chain without being interrupted. Evokers also have 2 schools of magic, so when you get interrupted in one of them, you can alternate with the other. Evokers are new, people are still learning how to play it, but in my opinion it is no doubt an A+ tier class. Now to the Hunter. Hunters have very good crowd control setup. They can either stun you into freezing trap or root you into freezing trap. Either way, both skills are instant cast and have a low cooldown. Hunters also have access to some of the highest mobility a ranged class has in the game, and their Feign Death plus shield skill gives them pretty good defense. Survival Hunter is a good all-around spec. You have good damage, good crowd control, good mobility and good defense. For that reason, Survival is a middle of the pack A tier class. Beastmaster has pretty good damage and the best class in a line of sight situation. Line of sight barely affects Beastmasters, as most of your damage comes from your pet, and your pet will go around pillars without a problem. And as such, you don't need to have direct vision to your target for your pet to hunt them down. Both Survival and Beastmaster are middle of the pack A tier classes. They are not bad at all, they are pretty good, but also they can't compete with the S tier classes, and as such they are what you might call balanced. Marksmanship, much like Arms Warrior, hasn't really been tuned yet, and as such they don't really have enough damage to make any kind of pressure. Marksmanship were famous in Shadowlands for their one-shots out of stealth. That is no longer the case, they can barely do it even if you are AFK. With that said, Blizzard has announced a 10% damage buff to marksmanship, and that alone might be enough to bump them into the bottom of the A tier class. Now it's time for the class that everyone who doesn't play it hates, Rogue. Rogues have incredibly high mobility, incredibly high crowd control, very good peeling through stuns, duel and disarm, a permanent healing reduction effect. However, they are finally killable. Throughout Shadowlands, rogues were the tankiest melee DPS in the game. That really made no sense at all for an assassin type class, but I'm happy to say that that is no longer the case. However frustrating to kill, they can indeed die. And I think I speak for most people here, rogues look pretty good in the arena's floor. The best rogue spec in the game at the moment is Assassination. You are pretty much a feral druid with less defense. Pretty much all your damage comes from dots, meaning that all that damage keeps going even when you are CC'd. Assassination is no doubt an A+ class, but I don't believe it is quite at that level yet. Subtlety Rogue is pretty much the same, however they no longer one-shot you within a second, but make no mistake, Blizzard has already announced a buff to subtlety damage. So yeah, I guess some things just don't change. The Subtlety spec has even more crowd control capability than the other 2 specs due to Shadow Dance. Rogues are known for being capable of resetting a fight whenever they want, and that still holds true, however in solo queue it is much harder to do so. Sub-Rogue is a high A tier class at the moment, but depending on the upcoming buffs it will either be an A+ tier class or it will just go back to S tier. Then we have Outlaw. Outlaw offers rogues more of a brawler playstyle. It is still capable of doing very high damage. However, due to rolled bones, it is a little bit of an RNG spec. Outlaw is in the middle of the pack, so I'll put here somewhere in the A tier. Next class, Priest. Shadow Priests are incredibly overpowered, their damage is beyond insane, they have the best pressure in the game, tied with Warlocks, through being able to do very high damage to everyone in the enemy team throughout the entire match. Crazy enough, Shadow Priests not only do insane, constant damage, but they now also have a ridiculously hard-hitting single target burst. Shadow Priests are their own healers, they have amazing self-healing and shielding, they also have amazing utility, being able to heal and shield their teammates as well. Their trademark in PvP is Mass Dispel, which basically puts classes like Paladins at the bottom of the food chain and breaks your teammates out of some crowd controls. Shadow Priest has very good instant cast crowd control, they have an instant cast stun, an instant cast fear and an instant cast silence. They can also hardcast crowd control to throw a healer off a bridge or place him behind line of sight. Shadow Priests also have two schools of magic, Shadow for DPS and Holy for healing and shielding. If they get interrupted in one of those schools, they can simply shift their playstyle to either offensive as in Shadow or defensive as in Holy. The only two cons a Shadow Priest has is being the lowest mobility class in the game and being quite vulnerable to these spells themselves. Shadow Priest is ridiculously overpowered at the moment, and it is an S+++++ tier class. Next up, the Warlock. Much like Shadow Priest's Warlock damage and pressure is insane, they can also pressure the entire enemy team throughout the game. They have the highest DPS in the arena, only rivaled by the sad Shadow Priest. They have amazing self-healing and team healing through health stones. Both those health stones and some of their self-healing is percentage based, which means that their ridiculously high HP pool just becomes even more effective. No other DPS class in the game gets even close to a Warlock's HP pool. Warlock is the tankiest DPS at the moment, and it also has pretty good crowd control capability. Warlock players like to complain about their mobility. Well, they have most likely never played a Paladin or a Priest. For such a tanky class, Warlock has pretty good mobility and also boosts his team mobility quite a lot with his gait. The Affliction spec is best at making spread pressure through very hard hitting and stacking dots, which again means that all their damage will keep going even when they are crowd controlled. Demonology Warlock may lack Affliction's dot pressure, but make no mistake, his pet more than makes up for it. Demonology pets are hitting harder than a Harms Warrior, and much like Affliction, even if you crowd control a Demonology Warlock, his pet will still be on your back. Demonology Warlocks are incredibly tanky, maybe even more so than Affliction Warlocks. Make no mistake, they are both unkillable. Due to their ridiculously overpowered damage, and the fact that you will kill a Protection Paladin and a Blood at Night faster than you'll kill a Warlock, means that like the Shadow Priest, they are an S+++ tier class. Destruction Warlock is also very strong, however it is not as tanky as the other two, and he is very susceptible to line of sight. For that reason, Destruction Warlock doesn't really cut it into the S tier. Next up, Shaman. Shamans don't really have the best defense in the game, and for that reason, much like the Paladins, they are often the kill target. Enhancement Shaman has both very high constant damage and very high bursts, making them quite a scary DPS spec. They have very high self and team healing, and of course they are amazing with other bursty melee classes, aka what people call Turbo Cleave. Shamans don't have the best mobility, but they do have enough to get all of their kit going. Shaman crowd control again is not the best, but it is pretty respectable. Elemental Shamans, much like Enhancement, have very high damage and very high bursts, pretty decent mobility, plus amazing self-peeling capabilities, which results in a pretty hard class to stick to. Elemental has amazing crowd control, Lightning Lasso is one of the best solo queue abilities in the game, allowing you to stun and do incredibly high damage to a target, and remember that just like the Evoker skills, Lasso is a channeled ability, which means that you can move behind line of sight during its use, without the ability breaking. Elemental Shamans also have multiple schools of magic, so if you get interrupted in one, you can adapt your playstyle for a few seconds until everything goes back to normal. Enhancement ranks somewhere in the middle of the A tier, while Elemental ranks a little bit higher, at the bottom of the A+ tier due to higher crowd control capabilities. Next up we have the Mage. Mages are a mobile ranged class with, by very far, the best crowd control in the game. No class comes even close to what a mage can do to the enemy team. A mage can control the match like no other. On top of all this, mages are way tankier than what they should be. To be honest, their tankiness is quite ridiculous. A class that has unrivaled crowd control, good mobility, and both amazing sustained and burst damage to be this tanky. I'm pretty sure that at the moment mages have the highest amount of defensive skills in the game, and excluding Ice Block, which if you're Frost you have 2 charges of, every other skill has a pretty low cooldown. Both Arcane and Frost are performing similarly, Arcane Mage having amazing team utility through massive ease, and Frost being the highest crowd control spec due to permanent, strong slows on the kill target plus freezes. However, if you get interrupted in Arcane you cannot blink, because it is on the same magic school, and if you get interrupted as a Frost Mage you cannot Ice Block. Both Arcane and Frost are top A tier classes. The only reason I didn't place them in the S tier is because of how broken Warlock and Priest are at the moment. Fire Mage doesn't really seem to have been tuned by Blizzard yet. It is doing very low damage when compared to the other 2 specs. And for what I have heard, Combustion can again be dispelled, rendering a Fire Mage quite useless when it comes to damage. With that said, if a Fire Mage gets kicked in the middle of his DPS rotation, he can still blink and Ice Block due to different magic schools. Now to one of my favorite specs, the Windwalker Monk. Windwalkers have very high damage, some of the best burst damage in the game, some of the best cleave in the game as well. They are, in my opinion, the highest mobility class in the game, surpassing the Demon Hunter in Dragonflight. Windwalker Monks have the second best peel ability in the game with Ring of Peace, only surpassed by Warrior's Intervene, and also have a pretty generous AoE stun. Windwalker Monks have a good instant cast crowd control ability with Paralysis, however it can be easily broken with damage, and in solo queue that is a huge liability. Windwalkers have a passive constant healing reduction effect with Rising Sun Kick, and even though people think they are squishy, they now have a lot of defenses to rotate through, which when coupled with their mobility allows them to reset fights almost as much as rogues and druids. However, Windwalker Touch of Karma, much like in Shadowlands, is quite useless. You can no longer spec into making it heal you, so at best you will discourage the enemy team from attacking you for a few seconds. However, most people will just burst through. If you are a Paladin player, remember that you can use Blessing of Protection to remove Karma. Very few Paladins know this, because BOP is known for making you immune to physical damage, however it also removes harmful effects, and Karma does count as a harmful effect. Windwalker Monk is a high A tier class spec, because even though he doesn't have much cons, the other classes still make more pressure than he does. Now to the Druid. As I've said before, Druids have Cyclone, the best solo queue ability crowd control in the game. It can be used to CC a target and make sure that your team won't break it, but it can also be used on a low HP enemy target when you know you won't be able to finish him off quite yet, and those few seconds can give you time to set up a cross CC on the healer and finish him off later on. Feral Druid is currently overpowered. It does almost as much damage as a Warlock and a Shadow Priest. Feral has very high damage, good crowd control, arguably some of the best mobility in the game. Feral Druids also have amazing defensives. They can simply use their bleed rotation and jump into bear form, becoming unkillable until they need to reapply their bleeds again. Even spending most of their time in bear form, they will still do as much damage as an A tier DPS class, if not more. Feral Druid is no doubt an S tier class. Their damage needs to be nerfed as fast as possible. It is quite ridiculous. Now to Balance. Balance Druid has pretty good constant damage and burst potential. They can kinda do what a Warlock and Shadow Priest does pressure wise, but way less efficiently. Balance is the second best spec in the game for crowd control in solo queue, right after Mage, due to their unbreakable Cyclone and Root Beam combo. Also, Balanced Druid is quite tanky, however, if forced into bear form, their damage will drop rapidly, unlike Feral. Due to how good and reliable Balanced Druid crowd control is in solo queue, I consider it an A+ tier spec. And finally, the Death Knight. I have played Unholy Death Knight for many years, and I have to say that this spec doesn't get enough credit. Unholy Death Knight is the only class in the game with access to 2 different interrupts. Unholy has amazing constant damage, amazing pressure, a pretty good burst window, and a lot of crowd control. Pretty much all your damage comes from your pet and your dots, which means that crowd controlling you doesn't really do much. Unholy Decay doesn't have a lot of mobility, but it does have enough to be competitive with every other spec in the game. Death Knight's Chains of Frost is an amazingly strong, slow ability that you can keep up on multiple targets at the same time throughout the match. Unholy Death Knight might be easy to be efficient with, but make no mistake, this is one of the hardest classes to master in the game, if not the hardest itself. Very few Unholy Death Knights know how to properly control and take advantage of their pet, and I believe that's why we don't see that many of them. Abomination Limb is an overpowered ability, everyone knows that, and like it or not, even a new player can make Death Knight work in low ranks just by pressing that one button. Frost Death Knight is a bit tricky because not many people play it. From what I've tested myself, it does have pretty good damage, respectable AoE crowd control, it still is a Death Knight so it does have access to anti-magic shell, one of the best abilities in the game. However, if you look at a Frost Death Knight and you look at something like a Fury Warrior, well, don't take this wrong, but a Fury Warrior does everything a Frost Decay does, but better. Unholy Decay is without a doubt a top A+ tier class, however, due to its high skill ceiling, it can very well fit in the S tier. Frost Decay, on the other hand, is a bottom A tier class. And with that, we have approached the end of this tier list. Remember that this is my personal opinion, and that the game balance is constantly changing. What holds true today might not be true tomorrow. At the end of the day, just play what you have fun with. This is a video game and people often forget that video games are to have fun with, not to frustrate about. With that said, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing. And that's it. Stay safe, stay strong, and I'll see you in the arena.